Hey everybody, tonight's video is called The Idolater, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Judges as we're creeping toward the end, where we're going to be looking today at the idolatry of Micah. And Micah is another name that you're going to hear later on in the Bible, one of the minor prophets. But I'm not sure, I don't believe this is going to be the same Micah as the book of Micah. But we're going to look at chapter 17 today. In verse 1 and 2, it says, "Now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim, whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and on which you put a curse, even saying it in my ears, here is the silver with me. I took it." So today's chapter and the next chapter, tomorrow, is going to show us just how bad things got in Israel in the days of the book of Judges. And really, we'll see the total depravity in their conditions and the error of the judges. And Micah was from the tribe of Ephraim, and we see that he steals 1,100 or 1,100 shekels of silver from his very own mother. And you know, stealing is bad on its own. Obviously, it's against one of the 10 commandments, but to steal from your own mother who gave you birth, you know, that is even worse. You know, just like with murder, there's different degrees of murder, and first degree murder is the absolute worst level of murder that one can commit. But we see that Micah returns the stuff to his mother. And what's crazy to me is that we see in verse 2 that she is blessing him after he stole from her, you know. Some of your mothers, you know, should smack you on the back of the head if you stole from her. But verse 3, or we're going to look at verse 10 here. It says, "Micah said to him, Dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes in your subsistence." So the Levite went in. And we see in verse 10, when we're talking about the 1,100 shekels, in verse 10, it shows that 10 shekels is a pretty good fair wage at this time period. So we see 1,100 shekels is the great amount that he stole. You know, if 10 shekels gets you by through a year's wages, you know, this is like millions of dollars today that you are talking in equivalency. But verse 3 and 4, it says, "So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son, to make a carved image and a molded image. Now therefore I will return it to you." Thus he returned the silver to his mother. Then the mother took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to the silversmith, and made it into a carved image and a molded image. And they were in the house of Micah. So we see that his mother is directing that the shekels, the money, to be used on an image to be worshipped. And we know that goes right against the second commandment, that you should have no other images or graven images before me. And we know that from Exodus 32, that when Aaron made the gold calf to represent God, he violated the second commandment. So they are in violation of the second commandment. And man likes to make God into their own image. I mean, we even have it today where people, you know, they'll draw what they think Jesus looks like in their own race. And, you know, and the American Jesus with the beard and long hair is a white guy. But we see that some today, they make themselves a god they put together, like children do when they build a bear, you know. Some people, they don't like what the God of the Bible in his word says, so they, you know, they take parts and bits and pieces to create their own God. And Israel was wrapped up into idolatry, plain and short. In verse 5, it says, "So they said to him, Please inquire," or actually that's chapter 18, the chapter 17 so short that it's so easy on the same page when two chapters are on the same page. Verse 5 sounds more like it here. The man Micah had a shrine and made an ephod and household idols, and he consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. So a counterfeit shrine and personal idols with a private priest is set up with the tribe of Ephraim, and whereas God's priests were of the tribe of Levi. And the defection here is one example of personal and family idolatry. And remember, the ephod is a specific garment that was worn by the priest of Israel. In verse 6 here, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so verse 6 here, we see a general characterization of the time and of the sinful behavior that takes place at the time. And this attitude had been mentioned earlier in Israel's history, as we looked at back about 5 months ago. And Israel looked to self for guide of morality and ethics. And I love the book of Proverbs. I read a proverb every day, the chapter for whatever the date is. And Proverbs 14:12 says that there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. And you see, people outside of Christianity, people outside that are not born again Christians, we see it around us. People that reject God, they have what they believe is moral or not, and homosexuality, love is love. That's a moral belief that some people hold on to. And that, as Christians, that's why it's vital that we follow God's way and not our own way or what society wants us to follow. In verse 7 through 13, to wrap up the chapter here, it says, now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite and was staying there. The man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. Then he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah as he journeyed. And Micah said to him, where do you come from? So he said to him, I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I am on my way to find a place to stay. Micah said to him, dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes and your sustenance. So the Levite went in. Then the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as priest. So verses 7 through 13, we see a Levite who's compromised by departing from one of the 48 cities that God gave for the Levite service to Israel. And we looked back at that type of part of the Bible back a couple months ago, back in Joshua 21. And then he sins grossly by prostituting himself as a priest in a private idolatry setting. And Micah, he hired the Levite, and we see that Micah falsely consecrated this Levite, and he gave a false confidence. And to wrap up, like I said, today's video is very short. We look at a new person named Micah who stole from his mother, and then he goes on to return what he stole from her. And we see that his mother directed some of what he stole to be used to make an image to be used in worship. And we see that Micah established an elaborate worship, and this worship was to serve and please man rather than God. Much of today's what people call worship is more man-pleasing than actually God-pleasing in churches. And I hate a modern day trend, in seeker-friendly churches that say, come to worship with us, for a personal experience. Worship has nothing to do with my personal feelings or your personal feelings. True worship of God is to want to please the Lord in your worship. It's not to make me get, feel good or, to be dancing or whatever. I just wanted to mention that. In today's chapter, it also provides a good summary of Israel's spiritual state during the time of the day of the judges. And we see that they follow what they thought was right in their own eyes. They followed their personal feelings, like some do with the modern day of love and tolerance, of follow your heart. And in 2022, if that's the year we're in, I don't remember anymore, so years just go by. But 2022, we see, in the same last decade, we see the same thing. Follow your heart is a popular phrase that you hear. And, that is why we have so much support. And I think every single year that the support for the LGBT community, even Christians compromising, being like, oh, the Bible's irrelevant toward it. We better not speak against it. We need to support them. Love is love, so on and so forth. And, we see people fighting for the rights, for abortion, for unlimited causes behind the abortion. And what we must realize as Christians is that God's word triumphs man's opinions. It doesn't matter what your opinion is. It doesn't matter what my opinion is. As Christians, if we are truly Christian, God's word is the final word. And we see that the chapter ends with a Levite looking for employment, and Micah hires him, which led to a false consecration at the very end and a false confidence. And that's going to wrap up today's video on speaking of Micah's idolatry, and we'll be looking at his idolatry in the migration of the tribe of Dan in tomorrow's chapter. So I hope you have a great weekend up ahead. Hopefully you catch tomorrow's video, and it's starting to cool down a little bit, still pretty hot. I'm looking forward to the fall time now when we start digging into the book of 1 Samuel. So have a great rest of your night. God bless.